It's Industrial Revolution time. So, we talk about a lot of things in here, but I would be lying to you if I said that, for example, the Safavid Empire has left an indelible mark on your life. However, the Industrial Revolution is something that has directly impacted every single person on planet Earth. There's a lot of scholarship out there that suggests that our sleeping patterns actually change because of the Industrial Revolution. So when it starts to basically dictate the intimate decisions and events of a human being's everyday life, that's how you know an event is really darn impactful. So, a little note on the historiography, which, if you remember, is the history of history. The way we sort of divide the Industrial Revolution is that we really divide it in two. So, there's the first Industrial Revolution, which really is a British only thing, and it begins at around 1750 with the development of the steam engine by James Watt. And it's a phenomenon that revolves around the textile industry and is supported by things like railroads, coal power, and steam engines. Then you've got the second industrial revolution, which some historians can have argued that we're still in even to this day. This is an event led by the United States and Germany at first, and this focuses on chemical engineering, the production of steel, and is powered not by coal so much, but by petroleum. So the question is, why Britain? Because if you think about it, Britain has only now come out of its shell within the last couple of hundred years. Beforehand, Britain was kind of the backwater of Europe for the most part. It certainly didn't have anything that made it competitive with, let's say, France or Spain or these other more established monarchies or European powers. But there's a few things about England itself that makes it sort of the ideal country to start industrialization. And the way that we sort of remember the numerous advantages that Britain has is the acronym PEACE: population explosion, the enclosure movement, agricultural revolution, commercial revolution, and the Enlightenment. One thing that definitely helps is new farming methods that produce new food, specifically the potato, where the potato could actually produce 2 to 3 times as much food compared to, say, other native European crops, like, for example, barley. So you have an increased supply of food. So, in other words, you're starting to see starvation become less common. Starvation and just malnutrition become, less common bottlenecks for population increases. You also see medical advances that reduce death rates. You see the inoculation of smallpox pioneered by Edward Jenner, which doesn't completely eliminate the disease, but it drastically reduces its impact. So you see about a 15% increase in the population approximately each decade. So just to put this into context, by 1750 in England, the population was around 10 million. By 1850, that had basically tripled to 30 million. So the enclosure movement. If you remember our discussion of manorialism and feudalism, you might remember sort of the diagrams we looked at of manors and how there's like a church and the Lord's Manor in the very middle of it. But usually off to the side there was a large field that was the commons, and this was available for everybody to use. But right around the time period of the Industrial Revolution, landowners began essentially closing off or enclosing that common field, which meant that your poorer landowners, your peasants, can no longer use that field. And so basically, they're not fired as a farmer per se, but they're hurting. And so what they do is, with less land available to work, farmers and peasants began moving to cities, supplying those cities with a cheap pool of labor. So at the same time that food production is increasing, you also see food growth becoming more efficient with the crop rotation system. You also see the use of new seeds, hybrid seeds, and the use of manure fertilizer, basically to make the crops that you do grow much more prolific. Additionally, Britain, probably along with the Netherlands, was kind of the flagship or the mascot of the commercial revolution. It was probably the most commercial of the commercial powers that emerged in the 17th and 18th centuries. So, for example, you saw the emergence of the East India Company. The East India Company and other sort of merchant ventures helps the British bourgeoisie become much wealthier even than their European contemporaries and counterparts. Britain was shielded by a lot of the negative consequences of the Napoleonic Wars. And so you also have the Bank of England that had been in existence since about the 17th century. So Britain becomes kind of a commercial superpower. Finally, you have the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment and its and I would even throw in the scientific revolution there. Both are very significant for Britain. Britain has a fairly tolerant society. I'm going to put quotation marks because it's not tolerant by our standards, but by the standards of the day, it was fairly tolerant. There was a culture of inventiveness that allowed people like Thomas Hobbes, Isaac Newton, John Locke, James Watt, Edward Jenner to do their thing. And it provided incentives for those individuals to sort of do their thing. You don't have an English, Copernicus necessarily or Galileo, intelligent people who are forced to recant their findings. Finally, and maybe most importantly, even though it's not part of the acronym, the British system of government was remarkably stable. There were only a few brief hiccups in 1688 and 1689 with the Glorious Revolution, and admittedly, you did have the sort of English Civil War thing. But who hasn't, or who hasn't had a civil war during this time period? The other thing is that remember that in English common law, you have the Magna Carta. And the Magna Carta, among other things, provides due process rights so that the state can't just randomly take somebody's property without offering them compensation. So, in other words, people could feel comfortable investing in things, putting their money in places, knowing that the state, worst case scenario, would have to compensate them if they just decided to take their stuff. There were no real limitations on the state's capacity to confiscate the property of other people in continental Europe, but you do have those protections in Britain. So there are other factors that contribute to the Industrial Revolution beginning in England. One is the proximity to waterways, partially because it's much cheaper and more efficient to transport things by waterway than it is to transport them over land. The widespread availability of coal and iron, and for now, at least timber, though admittedly, one of the dramatic transformations during the Industrial Revolution is the fact that most of Britain's natural forests are depleted because they're cut down either to make way for urban expansion or more likely to fuel the fires of industry. Urbanization. The city of London was obviously one of the largest cities in the world at the time, but not just the city of London. You also had the emergence of other large urban centers, like, for example, Birmingham, Leeds, Manchester, Liverpool, etc. We already talked about improved agricultural productivity. And we also already talked about legal protection of private property, not just in the Magna Carta, but also throughout the British common law. And finally, you have access to foreign capital and the accumulation of capital from the British bourgeoisie. So in other words, foreigners understand that it is good for business, good for their personal business, if they invest in the British economy. And of course, we already talked about the fact that the British bourgeoisie is practically loaded and flush with cash. So let's talk about how things are made before the Industrial Revolution and how things are made afterwards. So let's take a reasonably complicated piece of machinery. We'll say a musket. And that is reasonably complicated by the standards of the 18th and 19th centuries. It's got mechanical parts, you have to carve it, it requires you to know how to put together multiple pieces of equipment, it requires some knowledge of chemistry. Yeah, if you actually think about everything that you need to know in order to manufacture a musket, it's not something that you can just learn by watching a 45-minute video on YouTube. It's something that takes years of practical experience. So the person who knows how to make this thing, like a gunsmith, is going to have to be very, very well compensated. Why? Because there aren't very many people who can make this thing from top to bottom. It's complicated. And so because there is a low supply of expertise and a high demand for this piece of equipment, it means that basically this is going to cost an arm and a leg. And by the way, that is the case for pretty much everything that doesn't come out of the ground. Everything that is not some kind of agricultural product is going to be ridiculously expensive. Why? Because everything that doesn't come out of the ground requires a specialist to make it until the Industrial Revolution. So you got this guy called Eli Whitney who comes up with the idea of interchangeable parts. So here the idea is, instead of getting this guy to specialize in all phases of manufacturing a musket, maybe what you do is you just get a guy whose only job is to carve the stock of the musket. Maybe you get a guy whose only job is to basically bore, yeah, that's the word, bore out the barrel. Maybe you get a guy whose only responsibility is to basically, install the trigger. So when you break everything down into steps and you basically appoint an individual to do each phase of the construction process, you don't need this guy. And that's the secret to what's revolutionary about the Industrial Revolution. The new face of the industrial economy are these folks. Why? Because the real revolution of the Industrial Revolution is that no longer do you need smart, skilled people to make things. In fact, you can get unskilled, relatively unintelligent people, sorry, Kevin Malone, to make complicated things. That's what's so revolutionary about the Industrial Revolution. The fact that it breaks our dependence on skilled and intelligent labor. So whereas beforehand, you have goods like this being produced in maybe this guy's house or maybe a business on Main Street, now they're being produced in these massive factory systems and complexes. This allows for mass production. And the thing is that as the supply of goods increases, that's going to drive down demand, and it's also going to drive down prices. So from the perspective of your ordinary person, the Industrial Revolution was a fantastic thing, because now all of a sudden you can buy a thing that's man-made, and it's not going to cost you an arm and a leg. So before the Industrial Revolution, basically everything is powered by the energy provided by human beings and animals. Now you're relying upon things like steam engines and or water wheels and these other inventions that basically power machinery for you. Once again, industrial production almost exclusively focuses on the English textile industry at first. In fact, the spread of this industry throughout Europe and America is in large part because the English were looking for low-cost labor centers that they could expand to. But if we're looking at success in industrialization, it requires yet another acronym, I'm sorry for inflicting this upon you, called CEL. Capital, entrepreneurship, land, and labor. So capital is pretty straightforward. That's money, right? You need lots of capital, lots of money to basically create these industries. But you also need people who are willing to take the risk to build businesses with that capital. You also need land, which includes things like natural resources and the physical land that you need to create your factory. And then finally, you need labor. And remember that England has lots of entrepreneurs and money to invest. It also has, because of the enclosure movement, a large urban population that's looking for work. So let's talk about factories. These are basically just places where large numbers of workers use machines to manufacture goods. It doesn't mean that the entire process is mechanized, but I'll also note the importance of this. This doesn't really require any great technological development, right? It's more of, let's say, a modification or an improvement upon a system of labor. So the Industrial Revolution is as much about changing the way human beings work as it is about technological innovations. So, like we talked about, each worker is going to perform a highly specialized task over and over again with the help of machinery. If this sounds soul crushing, that's because it kind of is soul crushing. But the fact is, it made things much more productive and efficient. Now, if you lose your attention span, well, then you have this manager person that is supposed to directly supervise the work and make sure that you are meeting production quotas. By the way, the creation of this manager is something new. So, for example, if you look at what most farmers are doing before this, like even your feudal peasant who don't who doesn't own the land that they farm on, they're not being directly managed by European knights. They don't know anything about agriculture. Peasants are more or less allowed to kind of do what they need to do to meet productivity. And if they don't, well, there's going to be a very awkward come to Jesus with Sir Stabs-a-Lot. But beyond that, peasants had a lot of freedom in terms of how they were going to produce their crops, what they were going to work on, etc. Whereas now you have these managers and they are going to directly manage possibly your entire day. You no longer work by sunup or sundown, you work by this thing called the clock. This is where you start to have people actually going around with watches, because if you think about it, beyond agriculture, they're really, or even including agriculture, most people are basing their day, dividing their day based upon the availability of sunlight. Outside of maybe some scientists and some specialists, most people don't need to know the specific time of day it is. But now, with everything being so carefully regimented, the clock determines when you can maybe have your lunch break. The clock determines how long you're going to be working at the factory. And so life starts to be dictated not by the sun, but by the clock. Also, bizarrely enough, your managers, they have their own managers, like senior managers. And those senior managers, they might report to a corporate president or CEO. This person is in turn hired by a collection of shareholders called the board of directors. And of course, those shareholders include all of us. So the world is becoming increasingly complicated and bureaucratic. So as the factory system spread, work made in shops and homes almost stops entirely. This guy basically is out of a job now. Maybe you have a small number of people like these who can survive and basically market goods exclusively to the very wealthy, because industrial production doesn't necessarily make products superior in quality. What it provides is a cheap cost for a standardized product. But most of these individuals, yeah, like they go from having a middle class lifestyle to, well, if they have to basically go to work for the factory that basically put them out of business, they're going to maybe not get a lower class lifestyle, but they're definitely going to take a lifestyle hit. So these machines become too large and expensive to be used at home in the first place, so it makes sense to sort of centralize it in one location. There is a strict division between workers, managers, and factory owners. Oftentimes, the factory owners were sort of from the bourgeoisie. Managers tended to be middle class, and workers tended to be lower class. So factory owners saw an increase in wealth significantly. Worker pay was kind of a hit or miss thing. We do have to admit that there's a reason that workers are going to cities to find work. Some do it out of no other choice, others do it voluntarily. So oftentimes they are getting better pay than what they would expect on the farm. The issue is the quality of life situation. They're working very, very long hours, they're not working for themselves, and their health, their life expectancy, all of these things seem to be taking a hit. Now, we've already talked about mass production. It's the act of making many identical items by dividing work into simple repetitive tasks. We sort of talked about how this connects with Eli Whitney's interchangeable parts, but we first have to mention that it comes from the idea of Josiah Wedgworth, who is mass producing porcelain, or sometimes called Wedgworth china, because, well, most porcelain comes from, as we've said ad nauseum in this course, China. This increases a demand for porcelain in Britain, and Wedgworth is maximizing the efficiency of his factory by basically dividing tasks up amongst his workers. But again, the mother of all industries during this time period is, of course, British textiles. So there is a growing demand for cotton. We already talked about how cotton is generally superior to most forms of clothing around the time period. But the problem is that it is obviously something that is slow and cumbersome to really process into textiles. Cotton cloth has historically come from India, especially, but also China and the Middle East. But Britain starts importing its own cotton, and it starts to sort of innovate on the production process. So the first major innovation by the mid-1760s, which is like shortly after the development of the steam engine, is James Hargreaves' spinning jenny. Basically what this would do is it would allow workers to basically weave together 6 to 8 strands at once, which creates one sort of uniform thread. In 1769, Richard Arkwright invents a water frame that uses water power to help power these spinning jennies. And basically, in 1779, Samuel Crompton invents what's called the mule, not the animal, but basically something that combines the best features of water power and the spinning jenny to basically create a thread that's much more uniform than previous iterations. Then you have Edmund Cartwright, who basically uses a power loom with water power, which increases the efficiency and speed of production considerably. But finally, in 1793, you have the invention of the cotton gin. The problem with cotton is that it has to be gone through with sometimes literally a fine-tooth comb to eliminate the imperfections, the burrs, basically the crud that you find within cotton itself. Basically, Eli Whitney develops this very simple turn crank machine where you feed cotton in, and it basically claws out all the imperfections. As a corollary, we should also note that this dramatically increases the demand for slavery because now the only limitation to producing textiles is the amount of cotton that you can successfully plant and harvest, and so the demand for slavery skyrockets. Of course, the irony of this is that Britain would soon outlaw slavery and, in fact, attempt to go to war with the slave trade in the early 19th century. But obviously, the textile industry itself is dependent upon the labor of slaves. So the overall result is the output of cotton fiber from British textile factories goes from 40 million yards in 1785 to more than 2 billion yards less than a century later in 1850. You also get tons of new inventions out of the first industrial revolution and the second one. I'm going to focus particularly on the first industrial revolution because it's most relevant to what we're talking about right now. So steam engine, obviously, the use of fossil fuels like coal and oil. And finally, you get construction of canals, the telegraph, steamships, and railroads. And I'm going to talk about all of these together because there's this thing called the market revolution, that happens right around the same time as the first industrial revolution. So you can mass produce stuff, but if it costs you a fortune to send those goods, those finished goods to market, well, then it's not really going to benefit you. So the idea of the market revolution is you expand the water-based transportation by building canals, you sail down those rivers with steamships, and you also build networks of railroads. Basically, by the end of this period, by the end of the market revolution, the cost to transport goods basically goes down almost tenfold. And the speed of transporting goods to market increases exponentially. This is particularly important, by the way, for farmers. So farmers are at the mercy of their harvest basically rotting away almost as soon as they harvest it. So they have to get this stuff to market very, very quickly. And historically, they've only had they basically have to go to a marketplace that's very, very close to where they are. But with the market revolution, suddenly your only limiting factor is just cost. In some cases, you can conceivably transport your harvest anywhere across the globe. So this improves lives for farmers considerably, but it also means that they face new competition. So if we're looking at industrialization, we think of it as kind of almost like a domino effect. So it starts in Great Britain, and for a long time it is a British-only thing. By the mid-1800s, it had spread to France, Germany, Belgium, and the United States. So after Britain, it then sort of spreads to Belgium, which also has rich coal deposits. So Belgium becomes one of the industrial powerhouses of Europe, interestingly. But then, of course, it quickly spreads to France. And after France, Germany follows. One thing that we have to mention is that these countries don't quite have the same political stability that Britain does. France has had three major revolutions: the French Revolution, the Revolution of 1830, and the Revolution of 1848. And that's not even counting all of the numerous coups d'etats, revolts, and attempted revolutions that we've seen, including Napoleon coming in and overthrowing the monarchy again, Napoleon coming in and basically overthrowing the revolutionary government. Napoleon, just cut it out, Napoleon, please. Love you, buddy, but stop. In northern Germany, the old home place of the Hanseatic League, you do see some more industrialization, and industrialization expands significantly once Germany unifies in 1871. From that point, it's Germany that quickly becomes the industrial powerhouse of Europe, not Britain. So there's a lot I could say about this, but I'm going to try to keep it brief because I know that while I know that you guys are fascinated by the history of insurance, I don't think you need a finance degree in order to take this course. So with the Industrial Revolution, you see the emergence of things like insurance. Basically, this is to ensure or provide compensation if there is a loss experienced by individuals or businesses. Like, for example, imagine if the machinery of a factory goes down, you could buy insurance policies to make sure that it didn't set your corporation back too much. You also see the emergence of stock markets. These become critical in the raising of capital, where basically shareholders can invest in corporations, and in return, they get most oftentimes a share of the profits and partial control of a corporation. And then finally, there's enough gold in the European economy now that governments, specifically the British government, can set what is called the gold standard, where basically currency becomes pegged to the value of gold. From 1860 to 1873, corporations in Europe basically doubled, and among those companies are these new monopolies, where you see the beginnings of both national and, in some cases, international monopolies. So, for example, in the United States, somebody like John D. Rockefeller, who controlled the Standard Oil Company, Standard Oil controlled roughly 90% of U.S. domestic oil production, but about 60% of worldwide oil production. So if you offended John D. Rockefeller and you were a head of state, you could find your economy, oilless. This is also around the same time period you see the emergence of transnational companies. So no longer do you have to have companies that are exclusively based in one country, because if you look at companies like United Fruit, if you look at HSBC, etc., they have shareholders from all over the world with boards of directors from all over the world. So we're moving away significantly from, for example, um, the era of mercantilism and the British East India Company, because this is what laissez-faire economics looks like. You have Adam Smith, who sort of pioneers the idea of laissez-faire economics, and then you have the economic liberalism idea, basically the almost the moral idea that the government should involve itself as little in the economy as possible. This is pioneered by John Stuart Mill, who is proof that intelligence can't buy good looks. By the 1820s, France, Belgium, the United States, and Germany are beginning to industrialize. By the end of the 19th century, Russia, to an extent, starts to industrialize, but Egypt definitely does, and Japan most certainly industrializes by the end. So, around Europe during this time period, and especially in England, the United States, and to a certain extent France, the bourgeoisie basically start to edge out the aristocracy. Even though you might think that middle class means middle wealth, that's not actually true. Basically, if you're part of the bourgeoisie, think of the fact that your wealth basically comes from your education or skill or something you bring to the table. Aristocracy means that your wealth comes from your family. There's no guarantee that aristocratic wealth is going to be any greater or more superior to bourgeois wealth. So you begin to see, especially in Britain, the bourgeoisie start to replace the aristocracy even in political power. For the lower class miners and factory workers, they might see an increase in their overall wealth. It kind of depends upon the availability of labor in the country that you're looking at, but factory schedules would invariably have very long hours. We're talking about 12 to 14 hours a day. Also, this is during a time period where child labor is not only tolerated, but also highly sought after because of the fact that small hands could basically get to small nooks and crannies in the machinery. So you have health concerns that were never really addressed during this time period, including concerns around noise, pollution, and also loss of limbs if you made a mistake in the factory. And the fact that, for example, if you get home very, very late into the evening, it's hard to also have much of a family life. Speaking of having a family life, during this time period, no longer do you see people having kids to basically help grow crops. Remember that for the most part, children were seen as potential employees on family estates. Now, birth rates began decreasing quite a bit, even as the overall population increases. So, in other words, assuming that everything is planned properly, families start having fewer numbers of children, and when they do have them, it's probably because they actually want kids, or they're more likely to do so because they want kids. Industrial cities were marvels, but they were not actually places you probably want to live, partially because it's unsanitary, partially because coal production of smoke, you have contaminated water, sewage system is not very well thought out, and of course, maybe more than anything else, none of these cities are really planned. And so you get lots of sprawl and lots of urban development that's just stacked on top of other urban development. And because it's unplanned, you get events like the Great Chicago Fire of, I think, 1871. And what's kind of amazing about that is basically half the city of Chicago burns down, but it doesn't actually impede the growth of the city. Okay, so you see population increases in the mid 18th century, but it slows down by the mid 19th century. Infant mortality decreases. You do see a higher birth rate and a lower death rate. Part of this is because of Louis Pasteur, who comes up with the germ theory of diseases, and that starts to make an impact in hospitals and leads to more hygienic practices in childbirth, like, washing your hands more. You do see the emergence of labor movements during this time period, but labor unions face a lot of hurdles. For one thing, many of them are thought of as being illegal by both factory managers and by governments themselves. Eventually, they acquire more respectability during the late 19th century in some European countries, most notably Great Britain, Germany, France, etc. The United States kind of lags behind there a little bit. So that is my whirlwind tour of the Industrial Revolution. Next time, we'll talk about the social consequences there. Till then.